Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your co-host today, Jen, and I am here with an author for the second time. And I am so excited to discuss this book, which has just completely rocked my world. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and the book, please?
Yes, of course. My name is Daniel Kraus. I am a writer of novels mostly. If you count the graphic novels, I'm at 20 or 21. I can't remember how many. The new one's called Whalefall. And it is probably my favorite book that I've done. And one of the reasons I like this book or like talking about it is it's one of the few books I can explain in a sentence and it makes sense. Which I think is a good sign for readers. Like I guess that's what is considered high concept. You can just here's what it is. It's the 100% scientifically accurate story of a scuba diver who is swallowed by a whale and has 1 hour of air to get out.
It is an absolutely electric, visceral read. It is like one of the few books to do this to me where like I really couldn't read it at night because it just got me so stressed out that I could not then get into like, all right, let's go to sleep and prepare for dreams. It was so great. And I do think it's very interesting that you said it does have this sort of like ready-made elevator pitch, because the last book that you came here to talk about, which was one of my favorite books from last year, The Ghost That Ate Us, is like a little bit harder to sort of put into words. So I'm wondering, like, what led you from that project to this one? Like, what were you trying new this time? And like, what new things were you exploring? And do you think that there are themes that you were still thinking about from the last one and this one?
Well, I definitely, in my career have tried to take right turns or left turns, I guess is probably the more accurate term, with every book. Like my MO has always been to try to surprise myself and to try to put myself into unusual positions where I have to sort of figure out a new way to write. I think the only way to to prevent one from repeating oneself is to create new roadblocks and new obstacles. And that's something that's both, I'm talking thematically, I'm talking about character and plot, I'm talking about present or past tense. I'm talking just the prose style. With the Ghost That Ate Us, that was written in a nonfiction style. It was written like a fake nonfiction book. So it had this very objective tone and footnotes and all this sort of stuff like that. And so my inclination then is to swing completely away from that, which is this massively subjective, inside someone's head, really real time thriller, really. So that's certainly by intent. Beyond that, there's nothing connecting the two except that I don't want them to be similar. I can't understand the heads that are on book 12 in a series. I just could not ever possibly do that. I have to try to completely start from scratch each time, and I think that is good for me. It's not necessarily good for the books. The cliche is basically true. Like readers do kind of want you to stay in the same pocket, and whenever I do kind of go far out, I definitely lose readers. There's no question about it. But if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to write at all. I would just be too depressed by having to stay in the same circles.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting swing between that one and this one. And I can absolutely see how this is like, a hard left turn from the last book. With this one, can you talk about, I hate the question. I know everybody hates the question, like, where do your ideas come from? So I don't ask that. But like, did this book have an inception point? Like, was it an image or an idea?
Yeah.
Or like, where did it begin?
Yeah, I don't hate that question at all. That's a fine question. I particularly like it with this one because unlike a lot of my books, I really do have a firm answer. And when people read the book, it's sort of covered in the author's note. But it really did start with an exact. I can pinpoint it almost to the hour of the exact day. But I was hanging out with some friends off Lake Michigan, and this was during COVID, so we were sort of hanging out outside. It was in the winter, so it was very cold. And the other two people I was hanging with had both seen this viral video of a couple kayakers ending up in the mouth of a whale. And there's a number of videos out there like this. They kind of surface once every few years. There'll be someone who captures something like this. Usually the headlines will say, you know, fishermen swallowed by a whale. It's never true. They're not ever swallowed. Most whale throats are the size of like a soup can. There's no way they could swallow a human. But they do get mouthed, and I'm not trying to try to say that it's not also scary to be mouthed by a whale. So in this case, like many others, in the video you can see these two kayakers, and this whale jumps out. It's a humpback whale, and sort of smashes right on top of them with them both in their mouth. And like in all these instances, they're pretty much immediately like spat out. And as soon as they said it, they'd both seen it, and I hadn't. But as soon as they said it, the idea popped in my head. I was like, wow, could you write a story that took this premise seriously? Like this premise is like goes back it goes back to ancient times. I mean, I think it probably goes back to before there's written records, this fear of being eaten by things that are bigger than us, whether it was bears or whales or whatever, this sort of like primal fear. And of course, it's in the Bible. It's, you see it in Pinocchio and Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. It pops up in myth and story. But no one's ever taken it seriously as a scientific fact. Like, what would that be? Like, could you actually survive in there? So, the very next morning, I got up, I watched the video, and begun researching or reaching out to people to see if such a thing was even potentially possible.
Yeah, I'm really curious about what that research was like. Like, did you talk to marine biologists or like just do reading? Because, it is funny that you mentioned Pinocchio and, Jonah, because I think both those things really led me to sort of non-critically have this idea of the inside of a whale as just being a big cavernous space, and it's not like that at all, obviously. So I'm wondering, like, yeah, like what was your approach to the research, and how did that shape your storytelling?
Yeah, I always do a ton of research, but this was very different. Usually I just read a ton of books. And this I had to start from a complete nothing because there's not really any ready research out there about this. I didn't even know if it was possible. Uh, so I contacted my friend Mary Roach, who's a well-known nonfiction writer, and
Cool.
yeah, yeah, she's helped me on a lot of books when I need some weird little detail here or there. She's interviewed everyone about every weird thing, and I asked her if she'd ever encountered anyone who said it was possible to be swallowed by a whale, and she had. I had forgotten; it had slipped my mind that she had a book called Gulp that was all about swallowing. It was all about like swallowing things, and there was a couple pages in there where she talks to someone who says a whale scientist who said, "Yeah, if it were a sperm whale, specifically a sperm whale, it is theoretically possible because sperm whales are the one whale that have bigger throats." And so she sent me to him, and I talked to him, and I introduced myself, and I said, "Look, I'm a writer. I have this weird idea. I want to know if it's like if I should quit this right now, or if there's something to it." And he reaffirmed that, yeah, it was possible and it was an intriguing idea. And he hooked me up with a couple other scientists. And this web kind of went on, and I met more and more whale scientists, diving experts. But those three scientists really became the three main people that I would go to, especially over the first month or two, which really was all. I started reading books, but really the research was first person. Like I was really just doing interviews. So I would talk to these three experts, as often as they would allow me to. We would do phone calls, we would do Zooms, emails, and I would pose to them like problems. I was like, all right, so if you're in the mouth, what happens in the mouth? How is the mouth connected to the throat? What happens when you're in the throat? What would that feel like? What would a stomach look like? What would it smell like? How hot or cold is it?
Mm.
And a lot of these questions they had answers to. Some of them they didn't and had never thought about before. But what was so great is, I mean, whale people have become my favorite people. Like they just, from what I can tell, just loved the process. Like they were really excited by the questions and got super creative with their answers. And really, the plot of the book is, um, it's led by me, but they came up with a lot of the coolest ideas because I would just say, "Could you do this?" And they would say, "No, you couldn't do that, but you could do something like that if you use this or that." Because really, all the diver doesn't. All he has is what's already in the whale. Those are the only tools he has. So it was a weird process that was exciting and daunting because I knew zero about whales starting out. And I know a lot about them now, but it really was going to whale school for at least 2 or 3 months before I could even really even outline the book because I had to understand what would even happen in there.
Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating. And yeah, it sounds like a really fascinating research project. I'm wondering, did you also read any fiction in preparation? Because I feel like there are a couple of subtle shout outs to like subtle and not so subtle shout outs to like maritime literature, you know?
Yeah, there are some. I finally read Moby Dick, which I had never had. I had on my shelf for uh, 30 years, and finally read that and loved that. I don't, no other fiction jumps to mind. I mean, the book involves John Steinbeck in some significant ways because the book takes place in Monterey, where he lived, and there's a lot of and wrote about a lot. So there's a there's Cannery Row, especially, was a book that is important to the novel. But aside from Moby Dick and Cannery, I can't think of any nonfiction that jumps out at me. I'm sorry, fiction
Mhm.
jumps out. I read a lot of nonfiction about whales and diving.
Cool. Um, yeah, like the hardcore, like very accessible but very comprehensive lesson in whale anatomy that you kind of get reading this book. It's so fascinating because it creates fascinating stakes, and it's kind of like a bottle episode of a book. Like, and I realize, like it's stuck in one place, but like that place is like an entire world, an entire
Mhm.
ecosystem. Like there's
Yeah.
just like it's an entire universe in and of itself. Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, was there anything that you had, I guess this is hard to answer maybe, but like, were there things that you had wanted to do plot wise that turned out to be um impossible?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah. I
Mm.
mean, they all started with my ideas. I mean, I would wake up and think, all right, I've got it. I know how this guy could get out of the whale. And I would present it to my whale experts, and they'd be like, nope, can't do that because of this. I mean, my first thought, of course, anyone's first thought is, well, you know, most people say, well, does he have a dive knife with him? Can he just cut himself out of the whale? And that's a total non-starter. Like it takes when a whale beaches, which is really the only time scientists get to study them, it takes them a day to with chainsaws and flensing knives to just get through like the blubber. Like there's no way you're cutting yourself out of that whale in an hour.
Mm.
So yeah, I would have lots of little ideas that didn't fly, um, but I was really starting from nothing. So uh, it was it was then a matter of guiding them with to come up with ideas, or to meet me halfway with ideas that would make sense. And boy, did they ever! And a lot of times they didn't even know they were doing it. But like, there's a limit to what I can say because of spoilers. But
Mm.
sometimes I would have a crazy idea, and I would say, "What about this? Could a diver do this wild thing?" And they would be like, "I never thought of that, but yeah, they probably could." And this is how they would do it. Um, and it was, the diving was almost as complex as the whale anatomy to me because I'm not a diver. I don't really swim. For this book, I did learn to scuba dive just so I would know what that's like, but that's against my nature. It's not something I was eager to do. Um, but and of course did, although it was mid-pandemic, I did fly out to Monterey and visited the Monastery Beach. It's called, which is precisely where the book takes place. So I did everything I could to make it as realistic as possible.
Nice. Speaking of the pandemic, I did notice that like it features sort of like not so much as a plot device really, but as just sort of like uh, ambient stuff going on in the book, like because it's happening in the book as well, and that was true in The Ghost That Ate Us as well.
Mhm.
And I'm really curious about setting things during the pandemic that aren't about the pandemic. Like how does that shape the storytelling? And is it more about is it about shaping plot or character or just mood?
It's an interesting question. When I was working on The Ghost That Ate Us, of course, I wrote it. The first draft had no pandemic in it, but then, of course, the pandemic happened. And that book, for all sorts of reasons, was very much tied to dates. When certain dates, that things happened historically and how they affect people who are a certain age now. And I couldn't change the dates. And suddenly I had all this plot of people doing all these things during the pandemic. So I decided just to go back and insert the pandemic into the real life, and it made the story richer. I found that it was a really good change, and it felt more honest too. Like I wasn't trying to get out from under or something, and it really just it enhanced everything. It made it feel more realistic. I was able to like actually draw out some character traits and themes that I hadn't expected. And so this was the same way. Like I could have, instead of setting it in 2022 or whenever, I can't remember exactly what year it's set in. I think 2022. I could have said, okay, it's set in 2019, but that it would just feel like I'd be so obviously avoiding it. Like I'm setting it randomly 3 years ago so I can avoid the pandemic. That felt like a weak dodge. So I decided just to embrace it again. And again, I found it to be really useful. You could really, it really brought out, it amplified, just like the pandemic did in real life. It didn't change us. It showed us who we were. And I
Yes.
found out that the pandemic did the same to my characters. Like it did show you what they're made of, what they valued, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a super interesting storytelling technique, and I remember being really taken aback and impressed when it was used in oh gosh, the Ryan Johnson movie Glass Onion. There's a scene where everybody is walking to a dock, and it's just like 2-3 months into the pandemic. It's super new, and everybody shows up in like a different kind of mask or lack thereof, and it was such
Mhm.
a great shorthand for telling
Yeah.
who like a whole bunch of people are really quickly. And what I like about your novels is that, they're not just in one moment. They sort of do take place over like larger time spans. So you see people's
Mhm.
like evolving reactions to it, and what they do over
Yeah.
time. Um, could we talk a little bit about the family dynamics of the book? Just take a little bit of a turn.
Sure.
Can you tell us about our protagonist and, how you shaped the relationship with his father? Because he's obviously looms heavily over the book, and the relationship drives so many of the protagonist's choices. Could you talk a little bit about where all of that began and how you shaped it?
Yeah. I mean, for people who haven't read it yet, it's essentially Jay, the kid in the book. His dad was um, a major diver in the Monterey area, like sort of a local legend of diving, but a troubled guy in some ways. Could never hold down a job. Felt sort of um, insufficient as a provider, and tried to introduce Jay to um, the world of the sea in too pushy of a way. It ended up pushing Jay away in a lot of way, in most respects. And then when and then eventually he does something that's sort of beyond the pale, and Jay leaves home and spends his last couple years of high school sort of with friends. And then Jay's dad, during that time, contracts cancer, and Jay won't forgive him, won't come back. And the book starts out with Jay going to the reason he's in the water. He doesn't, he stays away from diving now because of his dad. But his dad, dying of cancer, threw himself off a boat a year ago. So Jay is going to try to find his bones as sort of a peace token to his family, who thought he should have come see his father. So there's a lot. It's quite simple in a lot of ways. Like, you could sum it up as his dad was mean to him, and they were estranged. But yeah, it drives everything in the book, and it's definitely a topic I've written about before. I think my first, I'd say, 3 books were all sort of about these strained father-son relationships. They were just something that I'm familiar with and was interested in writing about. And then, then I essentially tried to get away with it because I felt like I'm talking about this a lot. I'm going to write about different things. And I think I successfully did that. I wrote up all sorts of different characters and themes. And then when this idea came to me for Whalefall, it felt so. It's like there was the kind of idea that immediately I knew this was a big idea. It's what this kind of one of those ideas where you think, how is it possible no one has done this? And I immediately searched around to see if someone had done this before. No one had. And the relationship between the diver and whoever is sort of guiding them in the whale could have been anything. So I could have forced myself away from that relationship to write about some other kind of relationship. But in a way, it felt like the book was daring me to write about fathers and sons again, and in a very, very head-on way. Like, it wasn't through really metaphor or these sort of more oblique ways I was writing about it before. Like, this was kind of almost like the final word on it. Like, I could just take this on straight on, and have this be sort of my definitive statement on it. And so I decided just to embrace it. I wanted this book to be as like emotional and as powerful as I could, and I thought that was probably my best route to that, because it's where a lot of my most passionate of my fiction is grounded.
It is like it's so heartbreakingly depicted, and it is such a it's such an interesting motivation, because like going out into the ocean to sort of try to find his father, it is at once like it's at once like confronting the issue head on, and also completely avoiding it and refusing to look at the actual issue, and it makes so much sense as a teenage move too. A teenage is like the kid who's on the brink of adulthood. And that does lead me to another question I had, which is writing a teen protagonist, but for adult readers, like, and oftentimes like adults are so condescending and dismissive and almost like disdainful of the ways that teenagers think and act, so how do you, when you are crafting a teen protagonist for adults, like how do you sort of like, because the whole book is about how like adults and teens can't connect really, how do you sort of like overcome that like how do you make that teen somebody that your readers can connect to?
Yeah, I mean, the decision to make him young really was originally just a practical one. For the swallowing to be realistic, the whale would have to be really big, and the person would have to be fairly small. So I wanted someone who could be, quite slender, and that his size even is sort of a something that pops up in the book about him not being big enough or strong enough for his dad. So that all kind of fed into the character as well. So that sort of dictated that he was going to be young, and that it was almost like it happens. Everything sort of happens logically. Like the whale experts telling me I need someone small. I decide they're going to be a teen. The fact that there's a teen makes me think, okay, well, maybe the relationship, it probably is not going to be with another teen if it's this grounded and deep seated. So
Mm.
now it's going to become about a teen and a parent. So it's like it's almost like the physicality of the whale told me what to write about as far as the characters. As far as like pitching a young character to adult readers, it's just not something I give any thought to really. I've written anytime that I've written teen characters, and some of my books are YA, and some of my books are adult, and really there's very little distinction about between them how I write about the characters. It's you could take a lot of my YA and publish them as adult, and vice versa. It As long as there's a young character, I think it's grist for either mill.
Mm.
And so it lends itself. I don't think there's very much difference in upper YA and adult. At least the way I write it, there are certainly differences with other people.
Mm.
That changes, of course, if you start sliding down towards middle grade. There's big differences.
Yeah.
But it's really not something that I even think about.
That is so interesting to me. Yeah, because I mean, I guess a lot of it is like too just accomplished by being inside his head, because when I guess now I'm projecting about how I think of teenagers in my own life, but I guess like we don't have the benefit of access to their thoughts. And so we don't always have the most generous assumption of, what they're thinking
Yeah.
about or feeling. So I just think it was, such a like a well done and realistic teen protagonist, but who just like made such good choices for horror and also good choices for like the chip he's got on his shoulder, and it just all felt like so organic in terms of his behavior. And as you said, like the whale anatomy and the setting. And it's just like, it's such a well done story. And, just thank you for writing it. It was such a pleasure to read.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it was a pleasure to write. Like it was such a different process for me, and in a lot of ways a different kind of book for me. But it was very fulfilling. So it's been really great to hear the responses to it.
Great. So what is your next hard left turn?
Oh, it's already very hard left turned. I'm working on finishing up right now a straight up science fiction novel. Like I'm talking like spaceships and stuff, like which is something I've never ever done. So it's another dramatic turn that has absolutely no similarities to this whatsoever.
Do you not to psychoanalyze you, because I won't do that, but like do you feel like you pick new topics a lot too because you like the research process and how that guides your storytelling choices?
I definitely do like research. I mean, I find so many good plot turns in research. I'll come up with like a rough idea, and then while researching them, that's when I come up with all the cool ideas that really make it work. It's like comes from the research, not my brain. So I think that has been so successful for me that I do seek out books that involve research, whether consciously or unconsciously. So not always, not always. Every once in a while, there's a book that requires no research at all,
Mhm.
and that it presents its own challenges.
Wow. Well, I hope again that you'll consider coming back because they say that like the ocean is the place that we know the least about except for space. So now we're going into an even lesser known place next. So I hope you'll come back and talk about space someday.
Yes, I would love to.
Great. Thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for joining us. Please check out Whalefall. By the time that you hear this episode, it will be available, so you can find it at your favorite independent bookstore or library. Thank you so much for joining us. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.